بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we have a very special guest, Brother Michael Abraham. We are going to continue discussing Islamic school and public school and raising our children. And this is an excellent guest to speak on these different topics. So, brother, if you don't mind just introducing yourself briefly to the audience, Jazakumullah khair.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah. My name is Michael Abraham. I'm a public school teacher, program coordinator, and educational consultant in the state of Minnesota in the United States. With my educational consultancy specifically, I created a K through 12 educator training program called Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools. It's been taken live by over 1,000 educators between the states of Minnesota, Washington, and Ohio. It's now being taken across the country on an online course that I have. And I also wrote a book by the same name, Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools. So I do that work privately, but both there and in my work in schools, I do a lot of instructional coaching as well.
Yeah, Barakallah Fik. I mean, you've spent quite a bit of time teaching in public school. In your location, there are a lot of Muslims in public school, so you're able to sort of see the effect it has and what goes on. You also spent time working for schools in Saudi Arabia. So, alhamdulillah, you have a lot of valuable experience that, inshallah, we want to share with the audience. But the first topic we really want to jump into, which is extremely important, is addressing this concept, this perception many parents have that the public school education is superior to the Islamic school, that their kids are going to be missing out on this great public school education if they send their kids to the Islamic school. So if you don't mind telling us the reality of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd say to anyone who has a general perception that American public schools are a guaranteed way to have a quality education delivered to your child, that is really a misperception. That is really a misperception. I would say that probably comes more from the sort of marketing aspect that schools and the education system, and then just America in general, do for itself. Because there is generally a market competition for kids in American public schools and in education in general. And the public education system is very much a jobs project. So in the society. So schools are always wanting to brand themselves a certain way and make themselves look good, and they're very active in doing that. They devote a lot of resources to doing that. So that perception is out there with people. And I have seen amongst Muslims and in the Muslim world, there is an extent to which people sort of assume that education in the West, education in America must be better. But if you look objectively at data behind it, you'd find that that's certainly not true. And definitely, if you have experience within the atmosphere, that's not true as well. And when I talk about education, I mean specifically about kids learning. And when I hear talk about public education amongst Muslims, it normally focuses on social aspects. And of course, that's a huge part of it, and there's a big concern of that, and there is a lot to talk about it. But underlying that, sometimes parents have a perception that, okay, it might be more socially dangerous for my kid to go to public school, but they're going to do a better quality job actually instructing them, so it's safer to send them there. Now, there's individual contexts around, and you have to know what's going on locally in your own place, but that is far from a guarantee. It's far from a guarantee. Now, I do instructional coaching with teachers. I train teachers across districts and schools here in Minnesota and now across the country. So I have a good perception of what is going on instructionally in schools. And something that I'm trying to make people understand, both in schools and outside, is, instructional methodology and the way teaching and learning takes place in schools is really in a complete mess in public education in America right now. Underlying that, if you're in America, politics, and I really dislike politics. I have a degree in political science, and what I learned from that degree is I really dislike politics. It tends to poison everything. If you live in American culture, the political battles in America just saturate everything. And unfortunately, something as meticulous as the instructional choices made in schools is not free from that. It's far free from that at all. So there's a political battle. There has been a long held political battle in not just the public education system, but especially in the colleges that train teachers over the teaching choices, the pedagogical choices that are made in schools. And it's this sort of left-right battle, which you can summarize as progressives versus traditionalists. And it was actually education was one of the places first where that word progressive was originally used, especially with an academic and a pedagogical theoretician named John Dewey, who most people have heard of them because most libraries in America use a system for organization that he invented, which is called the Dewey Decimal System. And he's a theoretician in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he called himself a progressive. Him and another theoretician named Edmund Burke Huey, who focused specifically on reading, who's had a big impact on public education. It's a lot to talk about and research, and I have some things on it in my book if people get it, that you can read more about. But you can somewhat summarize their theories as anything that it was against traditional styles of instruction. Anything that went against that would be good. And the traditional styles themselves, at their base, they are authoritarian and oppressive. Specific to this is the idea that if you teach a child something directly, if you directly bestow facts and knowledge upon them, that is something authoritarian and oppressive to do to them. And it's something wrong to do to them. So the only authentic learning that can actually be done has to be learning where the child, quote unquote, constructs their learning themselves. So John Dewey, like he was famous for setting up these schools in Indiana where the kids would do all kinds of hands-on stuff and projects. They do a lot of work with animals and this type of thing. So emanating from this, what became trendy in teacher colleges, and it gets recycled in new terminology each generation. But what is generally the trend in American teacher colleges is to teach that these progressive instructional methods are the way to go. For a long time, it was called discovery learning. Sometimes it's been directly called constructivist learning. I would say it's coded under the names problem-solving learning, and nowadays, especially STEM learning and project-based learning. These are all code words for the progressive methodologies of instruction. Now, the thing about these progressive methods of instruction is the most objective research you can find in the field of education really proves without a doubt that they do not work for teaching kids, and they don't work for creating positive learning, and they don't work for creating positive life outcomes. So, in the field of research, there's basically two types of research: qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative means observing and writing things down, basically. Quantitative means there's a statistical element to the research. So the way that quantitative research takes place in the field of education is you will have at least two groups in a study, two groups of students. And one group is going to receive a specific treatment. They're going to have a specific intervention done on them, like a specific new instructional strategy done on them. And the other group is going to have what they typically had done before. And then you're going to have some objective measures at the beginning and the end that is statistically going to measure their outcomes. And then as the outcome gets measured in what is called an effect size, which will be a number somewhere on a scale from 0.0 to 1.0, 1.0 correlating to like a 100% increase, 0.0 to correlating to no increase. So, studies that do this, education is a social science, and social science has problems with trying to create objective research because human behavior is never anything that it's not a mature science like chemistry or physics where you can break it down so mathematically. So there's always compounding factors in this and complicating factors. But the research that is done quantitatively, that does this type of A/B testing with methods, it's shown over time and very consistently, and it's well cataloged that the more traditional methods of education actually produce better learning outcomes. There's a statistician from New Zealand named John Hattie. People should look him up. He published a book in 2008 called Visual Learning. He's continued to publish other books after that. He did the largest scale assessment of all the quantitative research that has ever been done in the field of education over 2 decades in an attempt to try to isolate what actually are the best interventions and instructional methods that work for teaching kids. And he found overwhelmingly that the more traditional teaching methods, such as direct instruction, such as feedback that distinguishes between right and wrong, such as mastery learning, where you make sure that a student has mastered one concept before moving on to the next. He found that all of these overwhelmingly produce better outcomes than the progressive methods that tend to be favored by the theoreticians and the academics in the teaching schools. And he writes about how when he goes around teaching this to teachers, he gets all kinds of pushbacks because he finds that teachers, they've been like almost indoctrinated in the teacher colleges that you have to use these progressive methods. And then they're shocked to find that they don't really work. And me in the training I do, when I teach teachers about Muslim students, I teach about the learning backgrounds of Muslim students. And I teach a lot about the Islamic learning that goes on in weekend schools. Now, the weekend schools, sometimes they might have some issues because maybe we don't have brothers in there who are familiar with classroom management and this type of thing. And they might need to develop those skills. And there's ways to do that. And we can work on that as a community. But the fundamentals of Islamic learning are actually very, very good instructional methods. And they're instructional methods, and I show this in my book, Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools, that correlate well to what the best research in education has found. So me as in consulting and training public school educators, I'm actually teaching them about Islamic learning methods and showing them how you're actually going to get higher engagement and more success with students using these. And what I find with teachers who again, this is really it's a problem everywhere. They've been so inundated with you have to use these progressive methods. They take it as like a breath of fresh air when I tell them this and show them how Muslim students, especially, they have a background, a cultural background that sets them up to learn in this way very, very well. They take it as like a huge relief because it is so common. And I actually have a video on my YouTube channel that shows a long scale quantitative analysis that shows that the least effective training that a teacher can get is by going through teacher certification training and getting a teaching license. It has virtually zero positive effect on making a teacher an effective teacher. So you have teachers all over the country who they're trying to implement what they were taught in teacher education, and they find it's not working. It's disengaging kids. It's causing behavior problems in kids, and it's certainly not causing kids to learn anything. I find teachers they're like looking for permission to be more traditional and more straightforward in their teaching, which really is a logical concept. And a difficult thing about it too nowadays with this whole political battle. There was a book written in the 1970s, and a fallout of the civil rights movement that became very popular in the academic institutions of teaching schools and amongst these progressive theoreticians. A book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed by a Brazilian socialist activist named Paulo Freire. And what Paulo Freire said in that book, he basically just recasted the theories of John Dewey and Edmund Burke Huey, but he recasted them in a way in saying that this was the key to leading people of color out of oppression and leading colonized people out of oppression. That it was oppressive to treat them like quote unquote empty vessels by teaching them directly and by directly transmitting knowledge to them and directly transmitting what they need to know. And what you really have to do is make them be, quote unquote, active participants in their own education by constructing. This is a construction is a key, and constructivism is a key word used in the theories of the progressives. You have to make them a co-constructionist in their own education and leave it for them, no matter how young they are, to determine their own learning. Now, the problem is, things like hands-on learning, things like getting kids active in activities, things like putting kids in group discussions, small group discussions. These are all basics of the progressive theories, progressive theorists. Now, there can be some purpose for those things, and kids tend to enjoy those things. That's the thing too. Kids tend to enjoy it. So kids will report liking it. And especially too, since discipline of kids has gone through a transformation, and it's not as harsh as it should be, and that's a good thing. But it's hard for people to develop the soft skills that you need to discipline kids then and keep them managed. There's always this favoritism towards doing what kids like. But again, there's also research that shows, and I have in my book, and you can just see straightforward with a basic understanding why just because a kid likes doing something in school doesn't mean it's the best thing for their learning. And kids tend to like doing things that they're not going to find boring. But what's actually better for kids is teaching them, and John Hattie, that statistician who I said before, he says this: you have to actively teach kids that sometimes the learning is hard, and sometimes the learning is boring. So I mean, those progressive methods, if they do anything good, they might have a place for motivation. They might have a place for, giving kids a learning activity that is a little more fun when that's appropriate to do. But the problem is, what the progressive theories in education have done is they've made teachers think that this is the way that kids are actually going to gain knowledge about content areas. It's the way they're going to gain knowledge about science. It's the way they're going to gain knowledge about reading and math. It's the way they're going to gain knowledge about history, as opposed to just directly transmitting to them what they need to know. Now, the big problem with Pablo Freire's book is that it's made it so these methods, I mean, they're used everywhere. They're used everywhere, but they're almost more likely to be used in schools where you have a high population of students of color, because it fused those methods with the civil rights movements and with other academic theoreticians and advocates who generally want to lift, impoverished people out of poverty and lift up people of color who've been oppressed in the society. But you can see how these methods, they're actually depriving these kids of learning opportunities, because it's not giving them the opportunity to actually learn, because it's putting the burden all on themselves. And there's just, I could talk a long time about it. Interrupt me if I'm talking too long, because I've just dealt with this stuff so much. But
Well,
there's reciprocal negative benefits too, because when you put these kids in these self-constructing modes of learning in the school, they end up just over socializing, and the behavior management of the school tends to fall apart. Go ahead.
I mean, Jazakallah khair, you gave us a lot of information, and there's so many different directions to go. There's so many different things that I want to say. I guess first, can you just give us a specific example in terms of comparing like the traditional Islamic method of learning to, these other methods that are being pushed in public school, so we can
Well,
get
first
just
of
a
all,
clear example, inshallah.
first of all, an important thing for people to understand, most education in America right now in the States is based on what they call standards, especially in reading. And American education right now has a huge emphasis on teaching reading explicitly. And so reading standards, which are mostly based on what's called the Common Core reading standards in America, which 45 states have adopted word for word, and the other states have adopted standards that are similar, but maybe just altered a little bit. Teaching those reading standards and doing supposedly good reading practice that teaches those standards rules education overall. Now, I have some videos on my Instagram page, and I'll repost them on my YouTube page to show people how these reading standards, they don't actually involve teaching kids anything. They don't actually involve teaching kids any knowledge. They involve teaching them what is supposedly metacognitive skills that supposedly can then be transferred to any content area. So a common thing that you see in schools, especially in elementary school, that will take up a good part of the day, is you'll have a classroom where kids are put in 3 or 4 different reading groups. Now, number one, those kids, they're going to be grouped according to an assessment that they were given on these supposed reading skills. And that assessment is going to put them at a certain reading level. The level might be numerical, but some systems use an alphabet system, so they might be at K reading level or N reading level or something. Now, just that system in general of leveling kids, what it does is it makes it so um, teachers are told that they can only give those kids books that are at their supposed lexile level. Now, again, this is another thing that there's no research to back up. It's something that is based on modern theoreticians from the 1990s, especially, a program called Fountas and Pinelli, especially. And and the effect that just this leveling is doing is it's actually keeping kids stuck at a low reading level because they're not actually even being given the opportunity to read books that are above their reading level. And they're also, and the publication industries love these teaching theories because it's given them permission to create and publish whole libraries of fluff books that are supposedly at these different reading levels that schools can use as a classroom library to do these differentiated reading levels. Okay. And this whole reading level system thing, this has also been a way for schools to cover the fact that kids are not actually progressing in their reading level, yet moving them on from one grade to the next. Yet still moving them on one grade to the next. So parents, for all intents and purposes, think they are progressing, but they're actually being held back because they're stuck in a certain reading level, or it's only increasing in a small way year to year, along with their natural growth. So a common thing you'll see in schools is kids put in 3 or 4 different groups where in one they're reading silently, in one they're working with a teacher, where the teacher is going to be reading something with them and asking them a whole lot of abstract questions about the reading. Okay. Not questions that are actually making sure they're comprehending the reading or prompting them to comprehend the reading or giving direct instruction and direct background knowledge and information to make them understand the reading, but asking them questions to like make inferences about the reading, asking them questions to, determine any type of abstract concept about the reading, asking them questions, determining the main idea of the reading is a really common thing. And the theory behind that is that you're practicing these supposed cognitive reading skills, of which there's no evidence that these reading skills exist in a way where they can be transferred from one subject to the next in a way that is divorced from actually having knowledge in that content. So if you compare that to what you would see in a good Islamic learning environment, let's put the Quran memorization aside. The Quran memorization methods are actually something that's very, very good, which I can get to in a second. But just take the lecture style based learning that goes on in an Islamic learning environment. And you can even see it in the way that the instructional books and the explanatory books that are written by Islamic scholars are done. That lecture style learning in the mosque is usually done in a way where you don't move on from one piece of the book until the piece you're on has been very, very thoroughly explained. And once that is very, very thoroughly explained, well, now you've ensured that comprehension of that piece is there. So how the next piece is going to build on that, you have the foundation for that put in place. So, directly guiding kids through reading in a whole class way where the reading is thoroughly explained as you go, that is a very good instructional methodology. Involves direct instruction, involves feedback to the students that distinguishes between right and wrong. If you go to the basis of Quran learning, one thing about that is from what I've seen, the learning materials, and again, I talk about this in my book. People can read it, and in my training for educators, for public school educators. Like the books that teach Arabic phonetics, they are very well done. They are very good instructional materials because they lay everything out in a very incremental logical sequence and how they build on one another. And being incremental is very, very important because the more incremental you are, the more you've broken down the learning continuum from one piece to the next. And Islamic learning does this very well, and you see it in a very concrete way with the Quran memorization, because you can take some of those books that teach Arabic phonetics, and it might have 40 pages and, like, 8 or 9 rows or whatever, a few lessons on each page, and you can go through it in a way where if you're taught each lesson bit by bit, you practice each lesson, you memorize each lesson, then you're set up to do the next lesson. And it builds very logically to the point where you can go all the way through the book, and by the end of it, you can read Arabic phonetics perfectly. And the Quran almost works that way itself. If you start from the smaller chapters to the bigger chapters, it builds up slowly, incrementally, in a logical fashion. Now, again, all these progressive methods, what they do to curriculum is they almost make it like so there should not be a curriculum. I've actually had brothers who got teaching jobs this week who've contacted me, kind of panicked because they were expecting their school to have a set curriculum when they got there, and they found out that they have to just totally make it up on their own. Because again, like in American schools, oftentimes there's not a set curriculum. There's just these standards. There's just these standards that you're supposed to follow. And the progressive theoreticians, they see having a preordained curriculum again as something oppressive. What you're supposed to do is just set up things that supposedly get the kids to think. But the thing is, doing that, you can't do that until a solid foundation of knowledge is put in place for students and memorized. But that is being completely bypassed in the schools. So what you have is you have kids being put in structures that prompt them. It's supposed to prompt them to, like, discuss and talk and think a lot, but what it really does is prompt them into socializing with one another. And it's just there's so much wasted time in schools nowadays because of it.
See, that's the thing, is that we didn't even get to the social aspect of public school. You're just talking about the academic
Mhm,
aspect,
mhm.
and
And,
I took a few
and
notes
sorry, go ahead. I find people know about this less, and
for
to me,
sure.
to me, it's the bigger issue in schools. Like a lot of the other issues in schools, like they're not nurturing kids socially well in a good way, but a lot of it is downstream from this, because kids are so disengaged from school because the learning is so bad.
It really is fascinating, and I do think that it's not known, because even myself, as somebody who very openly um, suggests people to not go to the public school, it usually is just centered around the social aspects. It's not even, and it's not even about necessarily the academics in the sense that you're describing it. But I took a few notes because there's so many different things that you had mentioned. So first of all, the foundation. I find this fascinating. You're 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 telling me that the foundation of how kids learn in public school nowadays is they try to just get them to figure things out themselves, right?
Yes,
That
yes,
otherwise you're
that's
sort of
on
oppressing them if you teach them, which is so contrary to
that's
first of
honestly
all
how it is.
common sense, you would think, right? I mean,
And you
but
you know you know you know something I tell people who ask me about whether or not I should homeschool. I tell them the kids who do best in public schools, they're basically being homeschooled themselves because their parents are filling the gaps at home, or they're hiring tutors to fill the gaps at home. Now, unfortunately, especially for kids in poverty, who their parents are working long hours during the day and they don't have the time and resources themselves to fill that gap at home. These systems are hurting those kids the most, and it's at the core of what they call the achievement gap in the United States.
well, foundationally, when it comes to Islam, we understand that we have divine revelation, that that Allah is giving us this knowledge that's the truth, and that's what we need to learn. Whereas
Mhm,
fundamentally, this other method, it's like it has no concept of that whatsoever, and
mhm,
it's very counterproductive in the sense that it's like, oh, we just try to figure things out yourself. It's like,
correct.
as Muslims, we understand that knowledge, beneficial knowledge, it's granted to us by
Mhm,
Allah, and it's
mhm.
foundationally based in the Quran and Sunnah.
A
So
and
that's something that's interesting.
and it's to a point that, so bad that I've had to have arguments or debates with public school teachers just about whether or not they should teach kids knowledge. Just about whether or not they should teach kids knowledge and facts. There's a book written on this called Why Knowledge Matters by E.D. Hirsch, he's an older gentleman now, but he's been a long, well-respected, academic. Yeah, people can check that out to find out more about this. Why Knowledge Matters by E.D. Hirsch. and some of these problems going on in American education, especially. He talks about though how it's been adopted in France and Europe as well too, with problems.
Mm. Well, another thing that's fascinating about what you're talking about is how much school has changed, because when you were describing how they're teaching now and putting kids in groups and these methods they're using,
Mm,
there's two different aspects to it. One is I often focus on the fact that many Muslim parents didn't attend public schools themselves here in
mhm,
America to really know what's going on. But even
mhm.
myself, as somebody who did attend public school, the way that you're describing it shows me how even academically, it seems like a completely different thing. I went to elementary school in the 90s, and you were
Mhm.
saying that many of these methods were, I guess, developed in the 90s. So has it really changed in
The
terms of how they're teaching students nowadays?
the emphasis on doing reading instruction in a different way. There was a reading program called Guide and Reading by 2 theoreticians named Fountas and Pinnell that became really popular. It's actually the base of some, reading instruction. You can get licensed just in reading instruction now, and most of those programs are based entirely off of Fountas and Pinnell. And I have it in my book. I trace their theories back from what they admit. Their theories are ultimately based on the theories of Edmund Burke Huey, who was a progressive theoretician from the early 20th century, who, he thought, I mean, a big thing with him, he thought teaching phonics didn't matter, which is just absolutely crazy. And English, like Arabic, is a phonetic alphabetic language. There is more exceptions in the English phonetic system that you do have to know. But he essentially thought that English should be taught as by what you call an ideographic language, which, like, Chinese is an ideographic language. Ancient hieroglyphs are is an ideographic language where each symbol represents a word, as opposed to letter pieces that are strung together to make a word. So what you will find nowadays in elementary education, especially in the early grades, they can't avoid teaching phonics, but they don't do it in a systematic way. And you will find a huge emphasis on called on teach on what they teaching on what they call sight words, which are the words that have some phonetic exceptions to them. The problem is they've made that the initial emphasis of teaching in kindergarten and first grade. So kids need to learn these sight words, which means and they teach to read it as you just see the whole word and then you know it. And that is conditioning kids to think, to train their minds. Like, you have to read English like an ideographic language, where you're just supposed to look at each word and know what it is, as opposed to stringing through the word and connecting the sound pieces. That's what's training kids to do. And there's no doubt it's hurting reading at young grades, and it's part of why reading scores have just deteriorated since the 90s. The No Child Left Behind Act in the early 2000s made a big emphasis on test scores. So that was part of how that program got started. The leveled reading uh, aspect to it, publishing companies love that. So there's all kinds of special interests involved in it. But yeah, again, when I teach public school teachers, I will show them the Arabic phonetic teaching books and teach them how those are gone through. It makes perfect sense to them that that's what kids need more. There's a book called Alpha Phonics. It's actually a common homeschooling book by a guy named Samuel Blumenfeld. He made it in the 1980s. That book teaches English phonetics in a systematic way, where every phonetic piece is laid out in a logical order. The practice of it is spiraled. It works like the Arabic phonetic teaching books, where if you just walk your kid through that book and they memorize each piece, they're gonna know how to read English after that and how to decode every piece of it. And again, like, that book, it's like 15, $18, and it could be used to teach any kid how to decode English. But instead, like, the schools, they've kind of been tricked into spending thousands of dollars on these complicated reading systems and structures, doing training in these different structures. Again, buying these book libraries of all these quickly put together books, which just, there's a lot of money in public education. There's a lot of money in American public education. Everyone knows the money goes into it. Like, a lot of it goes into private companies that are trying to market the public education system. Construction phenomenon since the 90s. It's just a mess. I did have some education where I experienced some of the progressive progressive methods personally, but in I went to elementary school, middle and high school in the 90s as well, early 2000s. But this whole thing with reading has really taken off since the 1990s. Yes.
Oh, subhanAllah, jazakallah khair. Um, Perhaps we can move on to the social aspect if you want, because that's another important topic to tackle. Um, this perception that if Muslims go to an Islamic school or they're homeschooled, that they're going to be living in this bubble and they're going to be, socially unequipped with the world around them, things like that. So, if you don't mind sharing your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, the people who consider homeschooling and don't do it, I've talked to lots of those people. Here in the Twin Cities, most Muslim families like going to an Islamic private school is not a very logistical possibility for them. But homeschooling, a lot of times I find a rationale for not doing homeschooling is that people feel like, well, you need to learn how to interact socially, you need to interact with the non-Muslim socially, this type of thing. I personally don't buy into that. I don't. I think that's wrong-headed thinking as well. Excuse me. The social environment of public schools, it's very unnatural. It's very unnatural, and just beginning with the isolation of kids within their own age group. There's nothing about that correlates to the real world, quote unquote. And, especially downstream from these progressive methods, it leaves so much open for the kids to interact socially when they are supposed to be receiving instruction during class time. So, like, it's not just the time in between in the halls, it's not just the time during recess and lunch when kids are getting a lot of social time. It's actually in the classroom when they're supposed to be receiving instruction. Because with these progressive methods, teachers, they will put the kids into doing projects, quote unquote, or put them into discussion groups. That's a huge thing. But they do it. And of course, the kids, they don't actually go into doing the work. They end up talking socially. I mean, just another thing, about the culture of public schools. The kids who draw the most attention to themselves have the most social influence in them. And those are usually the kids who act out the most. And oftentimes those are the kids who they have the most problems in their background. But they end up having the most social influence in the school. So it's a lot of times the social environment of schools where the least mature kids and the kids with the most problems, they end up setting the social agenda in the school amongst the culture of the kids. Now this has like a literal this literally makes a decline in the kid's maturity a lot overall. Like it has a literal degenerative effect on the kids. And even for the kids who are not who don't buy into that as much, you know, the, there's lots of kids, there's lots of kids who are more mature and they won't buy into the general social atmosphere, but then they end up feeling isolated and they end up feeling put upon and they become the people who are most likely to be bullied in schools. And again, to me, the social environment, a lot of it is downstream from these instructional problems I'm talking about too. Because the whole other thing is downstream from all this phenomenon is a lot of the kids with the most potential end up getting hurt the most because the class can't move on in its academics, it can't mature socially because of these degenerative effects, and the kids who have the most potential, a lot of times they're the ones who are being dragged down by it. And they might not fall into the things that are as bad as some other kids, but it's definitely hurting their potential. Again, going along with the progressive methodologies and just the progressive mantra in general, people worry a lot about kids learning, explicit things or things that clash with their values directly in school that they don't want. I would say that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is more that they're not being taught anything at all. And teachers aren't, asserting themselves as authority figures, as moral figures, and as guides over the kids at all. Because they're told so much that you have to leave the kid to, construct their own learning and also construct, who they are as a person. So a lot of times, even the way the kids interact socially, teachers, they have a fear of intervening upon it. And that phenomenon is compounded when the teacher is culturally or racially different than the students, and that's something that's even been studied. You know, and Americans' public schools, not least of which is because of the large influx of immigrants and the children of immigrants who've come into the country over the last 20 years, it's gone through a huge demographic change in its student body since the turn of the century and really since the beginning of since the mid 1990s. So there's a huge cultural class between the general teachers and the students in many different places. And you know the racial equity movement in education along with that has had some good aspects to it. It's but you know a negative aspect is like teachers a lot of times they have a fear of like putting themselves upon the kids. So again like they're afraid to actually guide the kids and distinguish for them between what's right and wrong. So that leaves the kids open to being susceptible to the social pressure of their peers even more so than they would already. And I mean, if you've grown up in America, you know, and again, it's even known by research that media and popular culture is what sets the agenda for what sets the social agenda for young people, especially when they get into adolescence. And the entertainment industry and the music industry, they are very good at understanding adolescent psychology, especially, and learning how to appeal to it to hook kids in. So, you know, the typical pattern of a social atmosphere in a school is that the kids who can imitate what's put out by those industries the best, they're the ones who are going to have the most social influence. And you know, even kids who know that is bad, they will dabble into that in the schools just because they feel the pressure to experiment with it. And the you know that type of influence, the social pressure, the social pressure influence that comes from the entertainment industry. Again, it's all compounded by this lack of authority that teachers are willing to put on the kids. And you know, everyone knows in public schools, teacher motivation is at its lowest point ever. Surveying has showed that. Student engagement is at its lowest point ever, and it's the highest concern that educators have of among students. Now, just think about that. Just engagement in general, which like literally means just the kids paying attention to learning and just wanting to learn it all. It's at its lowest levels ever. Something that I find these days too that pretty much every kid will say, and this demographic difference I think has a lot to do with it. Almost every kid will tell me who I talk to that they've had some teacher at their point who told them that they're only doing this for a job. That is so common for kids to hear these days. That the teachers will tell them directly. And this is honestly, this is actually a form of bullying by the teacher, none of the kids. That you know, and this is not all teachers, but it is ones who lack the motivation themselves to actually teach kids. They will tell kids directly that they only care about this as a job. And in that sense, they only, you know, they don't actually care about how things are going in their classrooms. And especially if they are part of a union, and you know, there are some good things about unions that you can take advantage of if you advocate really strongly. But unions give teachers so much protection that, you know, bad teachers aren't something you can really hold accountable, even if you're the principal of the administration of the school most of the time.
Jazakallah khair. You've given us so much just insight into what's going on in public school. You've given me a lot to think about. Um, I think, inshallah, in the future, what we can do is have, for example, Brother Omar Shatila, who has spent a lot of time within the Islamic schools, and we can really sort of start dissecting some of the main differences. But just off the top of my head, part of me feels like, if this is what's going on in public school, there's probably some of this going on in the Islamic school as well, in terms of chasing them, being convinced that perhaps their methods work. But at the same time, I feel like just Islam foundationally, just memorizing Quran, learning Arabic, and our outlook on life, it's going to protect us so much from the deviations that these people are they're really just experimenting with. It sounds like these are new ideas. They don't necessarily even know the effects. It sounds like the stats that are coming back is it's very negative. It's not working properly. But just foundationally, when it comes to revelation from Allah, that's going to combat this mistake that these people are making, where you don't even. It sounds like they don't even really teach children. They're supposed to be teachers, but they it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that they almost feel like it's oppressive for you to actually teach a child the truth about things that,
I
um,
mean, the average teacher is in conflict, I'd say, but, a thing is most people don't actually research. Most people, like, they wanna do what they're told, and that's the easiest way to do a job, and teaching's not really, especially in this climate, it's not really a job that can work that way, you know? So most teachers feel conflicted, and they're just trying to do what they were told to do in teacher school, and this is the result of it.
yeah. Yeah, so I mean, there's the divine revelation, which gives us a hierarchy of understanding that there is truth. We know where the truth comes from, and that's what we're all just trying to follow that guidance. Um, even I would imagine that this is also very uniting amongst the students and the teachers, where it's not like I'm this teacher, I'm smarter than you, you need to listen to me. It's like we're all sort of on the same playing field in that we all are held accountable before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's upon all of us
Mhm.
to follow this guidance. So I feel like it's very uniting and humbling in that sense. And
And at the foundation of this in Western society, the progressive theorists, they were against, like, the Protestant Puritans, so the Puritans had a big role to play in the founding of American, education, and, they themselves were extreme and puritanical, so that is at the foundation of a lot of these debates, political and with instruction as well, in American society. The problem is, like, you can't project the Western religious experience onto Islam and onto Muslims, and Muslims can't let themselves adopt that projecting that the West does into themselves. That that to me is a foundational problem and a foundational mistake. You can't
so many of
material advancement, which the current generations haven't even done. They're living off of the oppression of their ancestors. You can't let that you can't let that make you think that they know something you don't. It's really the opposite. It's really the opposite, and I've experienced that in such a concrete way in teaching public school teachers about Islamic learning, and seeing the light bulb go off in their minds about how this in this vein, in this instructional vein, that this is the answer they actually really need to begin engaging students better. And
yeah, I
and
mean,
and so and so often
well,
so often from my trainings too, teachers will come out of it with the conclusion that, these methods, I don't wanna just use it with Muslim kids, I need to use this with all kids, and that type of thing.
that's the thing.
You can
It's
see
like
testimonials
as
on my website too,
simple
say that.
as simple as it sounds, Islam is the truth, and Muslims, we believe it's the truth. So let us let us like internalize that and act upon it like we have the truth. You know what I mean? Like as simple as that is, but but it even goes further than just that foundational understanding of divine revelation and truth from falsehood. But even for example, memorizing Quran, you know, um, as a Quran teacher, you have a class and you understand people are at different levels, and the beauty of even that, so for example, you take it a piece at a time. Like first you have to know how to read, you need to know the Arabic alphabet. Reading Arabic is it's pretty straightforward and clear. It's not like English where it's all these weird exceptions and stuff like that. And then you have like this goal in front of you, and you can take it a step at a time. um, Whereas it sounds like this thing you were talking about these standards that they have. I mean, kids get lost. Some kids are way ahead, but just memorizing Quran, for example, from my own experience, let's say somebody has no background at all. First, you learn the letters. The letters come together. They form words. You learn how to pronounce. You try to build your vocabulary. You memorize. You recite. And everyone in the class is free to sort of strive to their limit. You can really gauge where you're at. And
Mhm.
even in Medina, for example, we had certain curriculums, obviously. So, for example, in your third semester of on, you are expected to memorize and recite certain verses. But if somebody already did that, they could just come the first day of class, get tested, recite, and then they're done. They're free to, we're not going to hold you back. You're free to go and use your time more wisely doing
What
the things. Um, so,
what I see from
so I was going to say,
Islamic
like,
learning.
even within, go ahead.
What I see from Islamic learning is the instructional materials. They always have a precise, incremental, logically sequenced learning continuum laid out. Now, and again, modern education is just completely lacking in this because of the progressive methods I've talked about. Now, when you have that logical sequence and it's incremental, once you get the foundation in place, then the student can start going. They can start advancing on their own through the learning continuum. So that's the whole thing too. The progressives will say, well, yeah, you want the kids to be independent, and of course there's some the sort of liberal individualism thing is kind of theories are kind of behind that, you know but 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 again, like, it's the more traditional methods and the methods used in Islamic learning that actually can make someone more independent because it puts the foundation in place and it has the path laid out well before. You know, and obviously, especially in science and math, like you can easily just transpose that onto those topics. And Islamic schools should focus on doing that really well. A big thing that concerns me going on right now in education is there's such a trend of STEM schools. And a lot of Muslims are sending their kids to STEM schools. But STEM learning, as it exists in current education, is entirely based on progressive methods. It's entirely based on we're going to give you a way of thinking, and then we're going to set up prompts for you, or we're going to set up projects for you, and you're going to think your way through it. And through this thinking, you're going to construct your own knowledge about STEM, when science, technology, and math do not work that way at all. You need the foundational knowledge in those topics. So there's a lot of people sending their kids to STEM schools thinking the kids are going to come out knowing about science, technology, and math, but they're actually being put through these project-based learning methods that is, putting them into projects where the kids are having some fun, but they're not actually learning the knowledge that they need to know in science, technology, and math. So the Islamic schools, they should focus really hard in science and math, especially, of finding resources and creating resources themselves that really break down the material bit by bit and put it in a incremental, logical, sequential learning continuum. So just like the
Yeah,
Islamic books, you can go through it independently once you have the foundation in place too.
yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because this is really how Islamic knowledge is sort of passed down. So, for example, like we had mentioned before, it's very clear. Letters come together to form words. Words come together to form sentences. Let's say you start memorizing, you need to understand what it is that you're reading linguistically. But then there's all explanations. There's explanations of books, and then you have simple explanations. You have intermediate. You have advanced, and it's a very clear step by step means of building knowledge and being able to gauge where you're at and where you're heading and things of that nature. And yeah, that could definitely transfer to other subjects as well, inshallah. But we're going on an hour. I don't want this to be too long.
Mhm.
So if we can just jump into this last topic of the dangers of prioritizing the dunya over the akhira, in terms of some Muslim parents really um, focusing perhaps too much on pushing their kids to focus on getting a job, um, focus on going to a particular university, not really attaching them to masjid and the Islamic school and the community and things of that nature. So if you don't mind talking about that a little bit as we wrap this up, inshallah.
Well, I'll just say generally, with raising kids, having boundaries and structure is really important for kids and raising them, including in adolescence, including in their teenage years. A lot of parents they create reasons to let their kid go off too much when they get into becoming teenagers. Kids need boundaries. They need boundaries, guidelines, and direction at those age. Now Islam is beautiful in the way that it gives those to you really clearly. Islam makes the boundaries of what you should and should not do very clear, and that's a beautiful thing. A lot of parents, they will struggle a lot of time through their parenthood just trying to figure out what the boundaries should be. But Islam generally, it makes those things very, very clear for you. So it's a beautiful system in that regard. I will say I've known parents, who sometimes have the problem. It's a problem when you pressure your kid to take on like a specific profession too much in their life. That is something that I do see go on with Muslim families sometimes, or maybe to get into this specific college too much. That is a dunya oriented goal. That when you put that on a kid, it is over restricting them in a way that you don't need to, according to Islam. Now, what someone studies and what someone does with their work, they devote a tremendous amount of time to. So, so I have some videos on my Instagram channel that talk about motivation. I'm going to repost them on YouTube too. But generally, there's external and internal motivation. Whatever your profession is, there needs to be a strong element of internal motivation for that in your life, really to have a satisfying life, and for you to want to stick with it. Or otherwise, it's going to like emotionally damage you if you get stuck doing a profession in your life that you don't really want to do. So I mean, I've known people who've grown up and said, that they're never going to tell their kid to be a doctor because they were told they absolutely had to do that type of thing, and they're stuck doing it, and they didn't want to, or they were stuck on that path for so long and couldn't be successful with it when they got into college, and that created, they had to drop out and this type of thing. You know, like, Islam sets the boundaries that you need for a kid very well. So if you have so these dunya goals, sometimes they actually have an effect of overly restricting our kids in a way that they shouldn't. Now, when that is coupled with an admonishment towards them of, you need to respect me because I'm your parent, and of course Islam tells you to obey your parents. When you use that as a way of coercing them into just following a specific profession, and they're not internally motivated, they're not inspired for that profession. If you have a certain profession you've done and you can inspire your kid to want the same thing, that's different. But if you're forcing them into a profession, and you're attaching the emotional guilt using the religion of obeying your parents to that, you've really set the kid up to, when they get older, have a backlash against their religion themselves, because that is a way in which they're going to associate the religion with that over restrictiveness that was put on them of following a specific profession.
Yeah, jazakallah khair, brother. This is such an important topic. Inshallah, I really plan on making multiple videos about this in the future and keeping the conversation going.
Sure.
I think you've really given us a glimpse at how deep it really goes. I mean, in terms of the
Very
history and the
deep.
different concepts, and so many different things and so many different topics to really dive into. And it should be a priority for us because we're talking about our future generations. We're talking about the after for our kids and for ourselves. We'll be held responsible for how we raise our children.
Mhm.
And so with that said, if you want to see more from our brother Michael Abraham, check all the links in the description, and I'll give you the final words so you can sort of tell people, you can sort of wrap up any thoughts and also let people know what you
Yeah,
have
just
going on so that they can benefit more.
so you can follow me on Abraham_education on Instagram. Please search up Abraham Education on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. I'll be putting more on there, more videos about this type of thing concerning education. I've worked on this stuff for several years, and this summer I'm working on putting it out there more for people. My book is available on Amazon, Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools. I have a training program for educators that go along with that. It can be registered for through abrahameducation.com. If you know a public school educator, even just contact the public school institutions in your area and refer them to that. Please recommend that they take that training, because the stuff the public education system needs to know about Muslims and about all these problems. Even if you don't have a kid in the public schools, you're a community member in that place, and they have to be responsive to you. So please refer educators to my book. It's a book written for non-Muslims. It's a book written for non-Muslims. Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools. There's a training course by the same name. abrahameducation.com is where you can get it. Jazakallah khairan.
Wayakum. Inshallah, the book will be arriving today in the mail. So perhaps next time you're on, we can discuss that more in depth. And, inshallah, this is just the beginning of many future conversations. So everyone, check those links in the description. And thank you for watching. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome,